This season of Life Groups, we're talking about neighboring well. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus Christ who extends the grace and love of Jesus to the people at work and home, in our neighborhoods, the people we just randomly encounter? How do we neighbor well? And as a part of that, we have to ask the question, how can we be people who are willing to cross boundaries and barriers and fences in order to neighbor well? Audra, my wife, and I, we moved to Hattiesburg, Mississippi in 1997. And not long after that, on a trip to Jackson, we noticed that on Highway 49, there was this really nice, cute, white church. On another trip going between Hattiesburg and Jackson, we noticed that the red brick house just right beside the church had put a nice, tasteful sign just out in front of the house by the porch that said Psychic Readings by Gina. Kind of convenient. You have a church, you have a psychic reader right there beside each other. On another trip to Jackson, we noticed that the church had built this huge fence between the church and Gina, the psychic. And the fence went all the way to the road. And the effect of that is that you couldn't see the nice, quaint little sign advertising for Gina, the psychic, back by her porch. Not long after that, on another trip to Jackson, we noticed that Gina had fired back. She had moved her sign. She had changed her sign. She put up a 15-foot tall sign right by the road that blared out for miles around to see, Psychic Readings by Gina. So let me ask, who won that war? Well, Gina the psychic won the war. Who lost that war? The church lost. And not because they couldn't build a big enough fence to block the sign. They lost the war because they misunderstood what God is leading them to do. They chose to build fences instead of engaging the world around them. And here's the thing. We all do that. We all build our own fences to fence out people who are different, who are undesirable, who don't think like us, who don't look like us. Sometimes it's not that we build fences keeping us from others. Sometimes we simply live within the fences that other people built for us. We just live comfortable lives with the people who look like us and sound like us and believe like us. And we just live within the barriers between us and others that other people have put up for us. But here's the thing. God doesn't live within our boundaries and barriers and fences. God has always been in the business of pushing beyond our fences. Here's the story of the early church, because in the early church, they struggled with this same exact thing. In Acts chapter 1, Jesus has a last word for the early Christians. It was a small gathering of Christians. Jesus had been resurrected from the dead. He was returning to God in heaven. And this is what he tells the early Christians. Acts chapter 1, verse 8. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Now, we don't think much about that, about what Jesus said. But for the early Christians, it would have been quite striking, quite stunning. They would have been very comfortable ministering, being witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea. That's where their Jewish friends lived. All of the early Christians had been Jews who had converted to following Jesus Christ. And they would have been comfortable staying within the places that they knew. But going to Samaria, going to the ends of the earth, to be witnesses to people who weren't Jews, that wasn't possible for them. They had all been raised living within the Jewish law, and the Jewish law said to them that they could not enter the home of a Samaritan, that they could not enter the home of a Gentile, someone who was not a Jew. That was forbidden because those people were beyond the reach of God. And so for them to think of going to the Samaritan, to the Gentile, it was unheard of. So here's what the early church did. They stayed within their fences. They stayed within the boundaries. What we hear is that early on, that they worked in Judea, they worked in Israel, they went to the synagogues and preached to Jewish people about how the Messiah had come. But God wouldn't let them stay there. We hear in Acts as the story unfolds that a man named Philip in Acts chapter 8 ended up with some Samaritans. And he told them about Jesus. And the Samaritans began to follow Jesus, and Philip baptized them. And then later in Acts chapter 8, Philip meets an Ethiopian eunuch. And this Ethiopian eunuch wants to hear about Jesus. He follows Jesus and is baptized. And then we hear about Peter going to the home of a Roman soldier and baptizing the soldier and his entire family. And what happens is that the early church fights, and they fight about this. The earliest church fights in Acts 10 and Acts 15 have to do with where can people go? Where are the fences? Where are the boundaries? Where are the barriers? And here's what the early church has to come to grips with. God will not live within their fences. And not just that, God expects them to move beyond their fences because God's Spirit is spreading out into the world. The grace and the love of Jesus Christ will change lives beyond the safe places, beyond the comfortable places. And Jesus expects the Christians to go where God is going. So what does that mean for us? I think it means just this, that God expects us to move beyond our comfortable places, beyond the fences that we build, to keep out people. Here's what we all know. Our world is becoming more tribal. We live more and more in echo chambers. We live with the people who look and think just like us. But God is moving out beyond our barriers. God is moving in the world, and God calls us to move with Him so that we can be a part of what God is doing in the world. So maybe here's some things that you can do. Maybe the first thing to do is simply to read differently. Look at the places that you're getting your news and your information and read differently. A few years ago, a lady said, Eddie, I love the stories that you tell. I love the quotes that you offer. But have you ever noticed that most of the quotes that you offer are from white men? I'd never thought about it. And so I began to read women and people of color, hearing different understandings of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. And it began to change how I saw the world. Maybe you need to look at who you're reading and read something different, follow different people. Or maybe you need to do this. What if that person online who just frustrates you to no end, who makes you want to pull your hair out, what if you reached out to them and said, hey, you make me want to pull my hair out. And so I want to take you to coffee or lunch. I want to hear from you. I want to understand why you believe the way you believe. And then go and listen. Don't argue, just listen. Or maybe you need to physically put yourself in a different space or a different place. And so maybe you look for events on campus or in the community where you can go and be with people who are different than you, believe differently than you, and just be a part of the event. Hear what God may speak to you through that. Listen for that. Maybe make a new friend or two. Or maybe do this. Find somebody who you see them. They can transcend cultures. They are all over the place talking. Their friend group is wide. What if you ask them, how do you do that? How can I begin to do that? What I believe is the best work of God is done beyond our fences and our boundaries. And that when we are willing to name our boundaries and our fences and move beyond them, that's when we can experience the work of Jesus the most, not just in the world, but in our lives as well. Not too long ago, I was traveling again between Jackson and Hattiesburg. And what I noticed was that the fence was gone. I don't know why. I don't know if maybe Gina moved or maybe Gina stopped being a psychic or if there was a new pastor at the church. I have no idea what happened. I just know that the fence was gone. And I believe with the fence disappearing, that God was honored and glorified. And maybe for you and me, it's time for us to glorify God by taking down a few of our own fences.